Good evening and welcome to this concert by our Orville Community Concert Band under the direction of Mr. Bob Schofield. For those of you who might have gotten here a few minutes early, you were serenaded by Johnny Davis on saxophone. Johnny? Our tech crew tonight is our Kathy Zancanella and Cindy Denalou, and we also have a non-paid volunteer, hardest working volunteer because he's married to Cindy, Dan Denalou, who you will see at intermission this evening. The first number was absolutely, let's give him a hand. The first number was March of the Toys from the operetta Babes in Toyland, written by Victor Hebert in 1903. It was used again in the Laurel and Hardy movie version, produced in 1934. Our theme tonight is Christmas on stage and screen, and for the most part, we have stuck with that theme, but there will be a couple of exceptions. Starting with, one of the most popular operas of all time is Carmen by George Bizet. Although Carmen is a serious opera, our next number attempts to create some levity by juxtaposing several Christmas and winter carols into some of the themes from Carmen. Now, in keeping with the idea of a little levity, I brought a hat and can I just tell you, not everybody can pull that off. So, our Carmen Christmas, if you listen carefully, you'll hear Jingle Bells, the Ukrainian Bell Carol, We Three Kings, the 12 Days of Christmas, and Deck the Halls. We hope you enjoy A Carmen Christmas. on 3 spiritual hymns. This year, the band is pulling out what is arguably the most famous hymn of all time, Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace was published in 1779 by John Newton. Newton wrote the piece based on his personal experience as a slave trader. He grew up without any particular religious beliefs, but was saved by God's amazing grace. He went on to be ordained by the Church of England and became an outspoken abolitionist. The song was referenced in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Judy Collins recorded a version of Amazing Grace that spent 67 weeks on the charts between 1970 and 72. It's estimated that the song is performed an estimated 10 million times a year, 10,000,001 including tonight. The number is often performed solo on bagpipes, and our version tonight attempts to imitate that sound. Featured in more movies than we have time to list, here is our band's version of Amazing Grace. Christmas celebration to honor another religious tradition and holiday, and that's Hanukkah. The eighth candle is our next number, and it remembers the story of Hanukkah, which is also known as the Festival of Lights. It begins with an extended hymn-like section, followed by an exciting dance of celebration. The feast commemorates the victory of the Maccabees over a Syrian Greek tyrant nearly 2,200 years ago. Legend has it that after the battles were won, there was only enough oil for ceremonial lights to last one day. Yet through a miracle, the oil lasted 8 days. In modern times, Hanukkah is celebrated by the family at home, and candles are lit, one for each day of the holiday. Tonight we're honored to have Marco Payne, the director of the Las Plumas Origo Band Alliance, lead us in this piece, 8 Candles. LP Oroville Alliance Band concert. And you know, sometimes I think as we get older, it's easy to believe the world's going to heck in a handbasket at warp speed. So I can tell you, after watching those close to 70 young people who are dedicated, talented, on point, on time, I mentioned this last night at the end of the concert, I'm convinced that the future's in good hands. We're going to close out the first half of the concert tonight by going to Broadway. The musical Mame opened on Broadway in 1966 and starred Angela Lansbury and B. Arthur. The song We Need a Little Christmas was performed right after Auntie Mame lost her fortune in the stock market. Does that actually happen? Okay, in 1929. She decides everyone around her could use a little cheering up. Arranged by our own conductor, Bob Schofield, here is We Need a Little Christmas. So last night as I'm walking out of the concert, a fellow complimented me on the job I did. I said, well, you know, I'm very fortunate to let me do it until I get it right. So I'll see you next year. And without listening to me, he says, or the year after. Everybody's a critic. Well, we're enjoying the concert tonight in this historic building. This State Theater in Oroville, opened in 1928. And as you know, over the last 6 or 7 years, this community, the city of Oroville, water contractors, and a whole host of contractors and benefactors have helped us invest $3 million into the renovation of this theater, starting with our beautiful marquee. So, The organization that currently owns and operates the theater is the State Theater Arts Guild. I'm the president of the organization, but it's a pretty good group otherwise. What I'd like to encourage you at intermission is to consider joining Stage. We are a nonprofit group. Your donations are tax deductible. There are applications in the lobby. Annual memberships start at $25, family at $50, and there are a number of other ways that you can show your financial support for the State Theater. We have the opportunity in this community to create a legacy for another 100 years with this beautiful theater, and you can be a part of that legacy. So I would encourage you, please, to consider joining Stage. There are applications in the lobby. And if you have got someone on your Christmas list that is difficult to buy for, have I got a solution for you? Stage printed this book called Yesteryear's Child about the life of a woman who grew up in Oroville at the turn of the last century. Dr. Richard Rohrbacher, who taught drama at the College of San Mateo for 30 years. His mother grew up here in Oroville. This is the book he wrote about her experiences. He donated all of the proceeds to the theater. They're on sale in the lobby for $15. That hardworking volunteer, Dan Danaluke, that I mentioned earlier, will be happy to sell you a copy. Also hand you an application. And refreshments tonight are provided by the LP Oroville Alliance Band Booster. So, lots to take in. We'll give you about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll see you back here after that. Thank you. Welcome back. We're going to begin the second half of our program with the Sutter Buttes Brass. They're a well-established local brass quintet. For more than a decade, the group has regularly performed at concerts as well as playing in a variety of civic and cultural events here in the North State area. This Christmas season, the Sutter Buttes Brass is playing with the Yuba Sutter Symphony and Chorus ahead of Messiah in Yuba City tomorrow afternoon. With the Sutter Buttes Family Orchestra in Ripley on December 16th, as well as with our Oroville Community Concert Band this evening. The current members of the Sutter Buttes Brass include horn player Richard Morrissey, trombone player Mike Seringer, tuba player Jeffrey Hall, trumpet Matt Reithout, and Jonathan Klein. Tonight the group will perform 5 traditional Christmas carols presented in non-traditional arrangements, which are listed in your program. Please join me in welcoming our special guest, the Sutter Buttes Brass. Peter Tchaikovsky is recognized as one of the greatest composers in history. Following the success of his ballet Sleeping Beauty in 1890, Tchaikovsky was commissioned to write a piece that combined both an opera and a ballet. Hence, the Nutcracker was born, and although it was not well received in its day, Tchaikovsky allegedly detested the score, but it's now believed to be one of the most beloved pieces from his repertoire. Tonight, the band will perform several numbers from Nutcracker, including the March, Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairies, our conductor's favorite, the Arabian Dance, and Waltz of the Flowers and Russian Dance.
We're going to play one note first. distracting.
Would this count? I just want you to know that you folks at the State Theater in Orville, California tonight are the only people this season that will see this. In fact, I had someone a couple of years ago offer me $50 for it, and I said, really? He said, yeah, not to wear it. I saved him $50. When Charles Schulz created the Peanuts comic strip in 1950, nobody had any idea how popular it would become. And I just brought my script. Nobody knew. In fact, Schulz wrote almost 18,000 comic strips, and at the time of his death in 2000, Peanuts was still being published in more than 2,600 papers nationwide. The first TV program featuring the Peanuts cast was A Charlie Brown Christmas, which premiered 57 years ago in 1965, featuring the music of Vince Guaraldi. When Vince wrote the now famous Linus and Lucy theme, he was so excited, he called the show's producers in LA and had them listen to his creation over the phone. Featuring not only that song, but other favorites like Skating, Christmas Time Is Here, and O Tannenbaum, here is a piece simply titled, A Charlie Brown Christmas. We kind of go through this every year. There's no encore tonight. So the way that we've handled this in the past, and you can help me out, consider that last number as the last number of the concert, and this next number, which is actually the last number of the concert, is the encore. So somebody will say encore. Well, we are so fortunate because we have an encore for you. Isn't that exciting? And I think I can even find the script related to the encore. I think. Ah, yes. It was worth the wait. It's hard to believe it's been almost 20 years since the film The Polar Express came out in the movie theaters. It tells the story of a young boy who, on Christmas Eve, sees a mysterious train bound for the North Pole stopping outside his window. After being invited on board by the conductor, the young boy joins several other children as they embark on a journey to visit Santa at the North Pole as he's preparing for Christmas. The film was a big success and is still fondly watched every year on television by many of its fans. The band would like to conclude with an encore tonight, the concert suite from Polar Express.
Thank you.
We're not going to complain about the rain, though. But thank you for coming out tonight. We hope you enjoyed the show. One of the comments that I like to reflect on this time of year is that, well, it always seems like the bad news is all around us. Sometimes it's helpful to stand back and take a few moments to reflect on the beauty of this season and the reasons for the season. And also, remember that we live in a country where we can celebrate religious holidays openly without fear of retribution or punishment. So we are very blessed to be here. I'll close with a comment from Paul Harvey. Many of you may remember him, a radio commentator for about 50 years. He said, every pessimist in history has been wrong. Tomorrow has always been better than today, and it always will be. We hope you have a Merry Christmas.